Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Luke Reacts. So, this week I have with me some of the greats within Philos Project. Krystal Bracy, who is the director of Philos Black, and Wendell, he is the associate director of Philos Black, and then Jesse Rojo, who is the director of Philos Latino. So, and then there's me, right? I'm Luke Moon. And we are going to have a conversation, a rousing conversation about the topic of nationalism. Now, you might ask, Luke, why the heck are you bringing this topic up? This is a very dangerous topic. Well, it's because of that. One of the things that I have always loved about the Philos Project is we are unafraid to have hard and deep and challenging conversations, because I think we have to model the world we want, right? We have to lead by example. We have to, I want to make sure Philos is that we are thought leaders, not thought followers, which means that we have to. Um, we're going to put stuff out there that people will find, they'll be challenged by one way or another. They might be even offended one way or another. But the goal is not to offend. The goal is actually to in a sense guide the conversation, because that's what leaders do. Leaders lead. Leaders mean like, hey, come get on the Philos Project train. And what is the Philos Project train? Well, we are pluralistic, which means that we have all kinds of viewpoints within the Philos Project. Not everybody is like Luke, thank God. And as a result, we're going to have different viewpoints within the Philos Project, and what's coming out of the Philos Project is going to be reflective, hopefully, of those viewpoints, because I'm only one. Now, because there's the weekly Philos email that does go out. If you're not subscribed, you should. If you're also not subscribed to this YouTube show, you should also do that. And click at the bottom. You know how to do that stuff. But listen, the whole point of we have to we have to lead on these conversations, and the topic of nationalism comes up a lot. Um, I was recently at a conference called NatCon, which is a National Conservative conference. I was there. I listened to the talks, and do I agree with 100% everything everybody says? Listen, I don't agree with 100% of anybody says. The person who I like the best in this world is my wife, and we don't agree. Right? So, and then my daughter, oh my gosh, we don't agree either, because, I'm old and she's, 18 and thinks I'm like old. So that's the way it works. It's we don't, and the thing is, it's okay. Gosh, I mean, I can't imagine living in a world where everybody's like so boring and just like me. It would be so lame. And so that really kind of almost gets at the heart of what I think of nationalism. So I want to I want to define it for myself, and then I'm going to open it up and let my co-guests kind of share how they think about it. But so one of the things I want to make sure that people know is that, um, when I use the word nationalism, I for me, it's very specifically comes out of my understanding of God likes nations, he doesn't like empires. Okay? That's one of my starting points, right? In Genesis chapter 15, God gives the boundaries to the people, to Abraham, for what will be the people of Israel. He says, from the Nile to the Euphrates, from the mountains of Lebanon to the south. Like he sets up these boundaries, and he does that because God limits the growth of Israel. Like, you're not going to be an empire. You're not going to take over other peoples and just go and go and go and go like empires do. Okay, there's a lot of you know, whether we like it or not, America's an empire. Here we are. But we're also a nation, and I value the nation part, and not so much the empire part, right? But that's we'll get into that. The other thing I want to say at the end of the book, the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, you have this picture in Revelation 14 of every tribe, tongue, and nation standing before the Lord, singing holy, holy, holy. That to me is like, if you put those 2 kind of goalposts together, at the beginning, you have the establishing of nations, meaning like there's a boundaries placed on a people, and at the end of the story, you have this picture of every tribe, tongue, and nation standing before the Lord. And so I to me that if nations are at the end of the book, then nations matter. And if nations matter, then like we can't be against nations because God's not against nations. Okay, then what are we talking about? And to me, I see nations in the same way I see people, that every nation is given gifts and blessings by God. And my hope is that every nation lives out those gifts and blessings. And that's what I want. And I would say that, and so when I'm talking about nationalism, I'm talking about nations living out. And I'm talking nations, by nations, I mean America and Canada and France and Fiji and Nigeria and Ethiopia, like nations. Like, well, sure that we call them nation states right now, and they have certain boundaries, but it was always going to be some kind of collection of people, right? Whether it's the bunch of tribes coming together. I mean, like you have the confederation. Switzerland is a confederation of basically tribes that came together and say we're going to unite together. Same with Mali was a confederation of tribes. That's actually very similar to Switzerland's model, right? You have, obviously, Israel is a nation that's a collection of, or was a collection of tribes, and to some degree, I guess maybe still. But you have this kind of, to me, the point is there's a value to nations. And when I'm talking about nationalism, I'm talking about every nation living out as being as great as they possibly can, according to the gifts and callings that God has given them. That's my hope. And what I'm not talking about is xenophobia and anti-Semitism and the hatred of other nations. I think like I love other nations, but I love America as a nation too. With all its spots and wrinkles. It's like my family. I love my family. Do they drive me crazy sometimes? Of course, but I still love them. That's the basic. So let me start with you, Krystal. Um, I don't know if that's the greatest. I don't have a 2 sentence definition. I unpack that a little bit, but I'd love to hear from you how you kind of see nationalism or nations or whatever. How do you see this whole thing?
Absolutely. First of all, thanks, Luke, for having me. It's great to be here with you and among friends, Jesse and Wendell, and a wonderful topic indeed to discuss. On the question of nationalism, let me just start by saying the way that Jesse views nationalism, the way that you view nationalism, the way that I view nationalism, and even possibly the way that Wendell views nationalism is going to be very different. All of our ideas on nationalism and our viewpoints are going to be shaped by where we have come from. It's going to be shaped by who's in our family. It's going to be shaped by our very experiences. And so, having said that, my view of nationalism comes from being born and raised in Oakland, California, having a father who served in the military, a grandfather who served in the military, both in the Army, a brother who served as a Marine, an uncle who retired from the Air Force. So, my view of nationalism and my love for this country comes from identity. A lot of people view nationalism as a political ideology. Some will see it as an idea. Some will see it as a movement. I think, generally speaking, if I had to sum up what nationalism is and what it's looked like in my life, is advocacy or support for one's nation. But then I look at identity. I am labeled as an African American. Why the hyphen? Why am I African American and not just seen as being American? Or now, I guess the politically correct term is Black American. Where does the identity piece come from? Well, nationalism is also going to emphasize the importance of preserving and celebrating our Black culture, our history, and our heritage. And so this means honoring the contributions of Black people to this very nation. I'm talking about it in terms and in the context of the United States of America, which is the country in which I was born and the country in which I have lived my entire life. And so, nationalism for me, having been born and raised again in California, to who I was born and raised among, ultimately speaking, I would say it is fostering a sense of cultural identity and a sense of community. Once I got older, and I went to college and I started to my viewpoints started to take more shape and they started to enlarge as I met different people. I learned different people. The other thing I started to do was travel, right? So you think about nationalism. If you never left the United States of America, then your view is very limited. But once you travel and you start to see other nations and how other people live, you understand that there's also the aspect of social advocacy and political advocacy and things like economic empowerment and just solidarity with one's people. And so now my view of it is advocating for the rights and interests of people that look like me, of Black people within this nation. And so this means to me, because of my experiences in the United States of America, pushing for policies that address things like systemic racism, inequality, and injustice, but ultimately speaking, working to create a society, a better and a more just society for those who come behind me, and where Black people have equal opportunities and representation.
It's amazing. I mean, I love that you're. I mean, you connected to where you grew up and your family's story and your expansion as you go off to college, and then you've also traveled, right? Like you recently were in Nigeria, and I I was in Nigeria too. I love Nigeria. I love the people. That it was like the only country I've been in a bunch of countries. The only country I ever went to where like the graffiti was motivational sayings, right? Like I was going under this big bridge one time, and it was like failure is the first step to success. Was graffitied on the
It's
overpass,
everywhere.
right? Like you're
Yeah,
like, like yeah, it's like the country took the how to 7 habits of successful people and basically made that their graffiti for the country, right? It's just like such a passion. I love it so
yeah,
much. It's
yeah,
such so much energy, and like to me that's amazing. I love going to countries and like seeing them like as amazing, right? You
yeah,
can go to a country and be like, "Oh, this country sucks." Right? Or you can go to a country and say, "Wow, what is so special about this country?" And like to me that orientation of your mind helps like and we get we all want to do that with our own country, make it better. And this it's the hope. So, Jesse, I'm going to go to you next. How do you kind of define nationalism and how have you unpacked it in your own life?
Yeah. Well, as Crystal was saying, it really begins with me in identity, um, through the experience of my parents, through the experience of my own upbringing. In fact, the concept of nationalism, I didn't even begin to contemplate it in the context of American nationalism. I started contemplating that in the context of Dominican nationalism. Since I was I guess 2 years old or somewhat, we would spend months long vacation every summer in Dominican Republic. So I have a very vivid memory of growing up with my cousins and my grandmother, my great grandfather. He passed away like at 110 years old or something like that. I learned to play dominoes with my great grandfather. Uh, and in Dominican culture, there is no, I guess, with nationalism Dominican nationalism is widely accepted. Everybody is very proud to be Dominican. There are a lot of national leaders. They call affectionately the Trinity, Duarte, Sanchez, y Mella. They were the founders of the nation. You know, they fought the War of Independence. So in that sense, I've always learned to appreciate that sort of national tradition and affection and kind of collective, as every, you know, elections can be kind of intense, and Dominican Republic is always kind of like a festival. You know, everybody, of course, there's the political tensions that exist, but it's nonetheless a festival for that experience. Now, when it comes to the American nationalism, I saw through the eyes and lens of my parents. I saw how this country treated my parents. My mom came here with a working visa at 21 years old, roughly. My dad came here as basically a political refugee. As 11-year-old, there was a civil war in Dominican Republic in the 60s, and my dad, his family, they were all caught in the middle of it. It's a crazy story, war story, as 11-year-old man or kid seeing, you know, dead bodies and rockets flying over your house, and to make it out alive, to then land in the Bronx, which at that time the Bronx was called the Burning Bronx. There were blocks and blocks of buildings that were destroyed and abandoned. And he grew up in that context where there was a lot of gang violence, a lot of corruption in the police department. But if you meet my dad, you're probably gonna hear one of the most patriotic individuals that you meet. He loves this country because for him it became his home after what he lived in Dominican Republic, and he made a life here. And my mom as well. She came to work, and she worked her butt off for many years. So you know, I went to public school, PS 98, IS 52, and those were the years where every morning all the kids would say the Pledge of Allegiance in the cafeteria before starting off the day, right? So that's very vivid. For me, it was very important because I not only saw Latinos stand up, Latino kids, I saw Black kids, I saw Arab, Muslim kids. There was like three at the time. But you know, the majority, of course, were Latino and perhaps Dominican. Um, but we were all there, united, saying the Pledge of Allegiance. So for me, it was like I'm proud to be Dominican, but I'm also proud to be American. I don't have an issue saying I'm Dominican American or American Dominican because that's who I am. You know, it's my identity. Proud to be both, and I admire as well, like some I guess national figures in our history, and um, of course I recognize there are a lot of issues. My dad went through a lot of perhaps the worst part, but even in my own upbringing. But yeah, overall, that's how I think of nationalism. I think overall it's perhaps like that with the majority of Latinos because many of them come with the perspective of coming to embrace the promising future of, you know, moving forward, right? They don't necessarily see themselves in a racial category, but more like a class category, because that's what actually happens in most Latin America. There's a class divide more than there is a racial divide. So they see themselves as working Americans who want to move up the ladder. And that's why if you look at all the statistics, what is the number one concern of Latinos is money, is economy. They want to work, you know, and yeah, those are my I guess my way of engaging with nationalism.
That's very interesting, Jesse. I love. I had the opportunity to go, you know, sit at a riverbank with your dad in Dominican Republic, and
Yeah.
you know, had some
So
local
happy you had
food,
that.
and
Yeah.
yeah, it was amazing. It was amazing, and yeah, it's like you get Jesse talking about Dominican Republic, and you know, you better sit down because it's going to be a long conversation. So, when
Love it.
Wendell, you come from a different part of America, you know, different than Krystal and Jesse. How have you? What's been your experience? How do you define this term? Where do you go?
Yeah, so I come from the deep south. I'm from Louisiana. Things are a lot different there. I think there are other complexities to that in the sense that a portion of my family are indigenous people, and another portion is Black, and with the understanding of our story of both slavery and immigration to the United States, as well as territory that was taken over. So there's a lot of complexities to both the nationalism part, but I also say that for me, the high school teacher in me is screaming out right now, in the sense of, I heard Jesse say a word, and that is patriotism. And I think that we oftentimes conflate patriotism with nationalism. Krystal, you also hit it earlier, and you said that nationalism is seen more as a political term or a political ideology. And I do remember the curriculum in which I taught, which may or may not be correct, and that patriotism is a personal identity or ideology in which one has devout support of or love for one's country. When you start to get into the nationalism side of things, and this is just definition, it starts to put one's country before other countries. So this extreme devout support of one's nation. And so, Krystal, very similar to you, my dad was a Vietnam vet. And so I did have the privilege of growing up as a proud patriot. I think I've shared with you guys internally. We grew up celebrating the 4th of July as well as Juneteenth. I understood that my national identity included being both American, but truthfully, a Black American. And there were complexities within that. My dad would often tell me that when he was in the Marine, it was the first time that race wasn't as important of a thing. In the United States Marine, he would tell me that there is no such thing as white or Black, there's green and dark green. And so that my viewpoint on how race impacts it is very different. But I also say that I grew up in an era that America was full of patriots. 9/11 happened while I was in elementary school. And so that being said, we went from just singing I'm saying the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning, to singing Proud to be an American every morning. And so our sense of patriotism
to another level there, Wendell.
Yeah, we took it to a whole nother level.
I guess they do that in Louisiana.
Yeah, and then one of my by the time I made it to middle school, one of my teachers was going off to fight in Afghanistan. And so our level of patriotism rose to honestly a level of nationalism over time. And I would even say now, knowing the education system in America, nationalism is even starting to make its way into the classrooms in Louisiana, right? We went from just saying God bless America, and I'm sure we'll get to this conversation, to moving into a Christian nationalism. We went from just God bless America in our classrooms to In God We Trust, to now seeing the 10 Commandments in every classroom. And so I think that Luke, you were talking about our emails and how great they are. I think that some of the complexities that Black people have with this idea of nationalism isn't nationalism at its core. It isn't patriotism at its core. It's Christian nationalism, and particularly white Christian nationalism.
Well, that's a excellent segue, because I'm white, I'm a Christian, and I'm a nationalist. Oh my gosh! So am I a white Christian nationalist? So let me just unpack this concept of patriotism versus nationalism. I'd love, because I think I was, back in 2015, 2016, I was in this conference, and it was probably 40 people there, all people who were kind of in this, there was mostly Americans, but a couple of Israelis, some people from other nations, but mostly it was this, like, how do we talk about this, these values that are unique to a nation versus versus other nations, in a sense. And perhaps it's this concept, these concepts of like the universal versus the particular, but I'll save that nugget perhaps for later if we have time. But it's really this this point in which you get to um, like it was a discussion of again of patriotism versus nationalism, and at the root of these words, to me that's where the rub comes, right? At the root of patriotism, like the first part of the root is like fatherland. You're like in, you could almost like homeland, like where you live. It's a very much like that kind of thing. Whereas for me, the reason that I preferred nationalism over patriotism was actually because I actually like the word nation. I think the word I see nation in the Bible. I don't see fatherland in the Bible. And that was to me the kind of the difference, right? And so, don't put me up against Webster's dictionary. Like, well, I'm not over here defining the words as, is defined if you do a Google search of like patriotism meaning or nationalism meaning. It's just kind of, to me, at the beginning of the words, like, what does it mean? And to me, like, again, that's probably where I think we'll perhaps unpack the white Christian nationalism piece as well. But really, like, how do you see the difference between patriotism and nationalism? I mean, any of you can kind of bounce off that.
Well, I could say that I didn't necessarily contemplate a difference until perhaps more recently. I think it's been, at least in my case, since the 2010s, a more prevalent conversation of, I guess, in my sphere, of nationalism being a bad thing,
Mm.
and nationalism being different than patriotism. Again, a lot of it goes from the perspective that I had growing up in the Dominican culture, and nationalism, for the most part, is defined differently, I guess. Because first of all, it was an independence against the Haitians, right? The Haitians revolted against the French, and then there was this conflict between these uh, uh, descendants that were, descendants of the slaves, descendants of the Spanish, and descendants of the indigenous people that were there. If you listen to Dominican music, you'll hear all those instruments incorporated in merengue, bachata, which is the guida, the drums, the guitar. It's a combination of what Dominican culture is. There's a myth about these faceless dolls, and I say it's a myth because nobody actually knows if it's true, but this myth has stuck with this faceless dolls because it does represent this general sense of what Dominican culture is. And this faceless doll is ceramic and it comes in all colors, but it's always faceless because there's not a facial feature that represents Dominican culture. And we come in all shades. You're going to find members in your family that are white as snow and others that are dark as night. Like that's the context in which you grow up. And there are a lot of family issues alongside, but we all embrace. You see that not only Dominican culture. If you go to Guatemala, for example, and you visit, Guatemala is like 90% indigenous, and the color black is celebrated. If you look at all of the figures and the paintings, it's black and a female. So it's a beautiful thing considered in Guatemala. And you don't learn to see it necessarily as that. You see, speaking of national figures, you also have like not Juan Pablo Duarte, Peña Gomez, who was of Haitian descent as well. So I see nationalism, and to some extent, I feel like I've experienced that here in the U.S. And I understand that my experience will be different than other folks. Especially if you're in a different part of the country. I've learned that when I went to seminary, I went to Northwest Indiana. So that was the first time that, I went from the concrete jungle of New York City to the cornfields of Northwest Indiana. Right.
Mhm.
Where I thought everybody was a Democrat. That was my experience in New York City until I go to Northwest Indiana and everybody is a Republican. And I'm hearing for the first time these different arguments, and I'm hanging out with a lot of white folks. But to be honest though, my first racial like experience of racism was actually in Northwest Indiana. and ironically so in seminary as well. As a young kid used the N-word against me, and I'm like, I don't
Wow.
see that as a negative, bro. Like we all use the N-word. When I was in New York, we just never saw it as a negative, you know. But I saw where he was coming from. That was the first time I saw that, and you know, overall, I would say that my experience in Indiana, I've learned to just appreciate another part of the country I didn't know. That I realized that the country is actually much wider and more diverse. And sure, there are issues, but my general experience, that was like one time in 3 years that I've lived through that. Overall, it was a wonderful experience. And we did, a lot of great ministry in different parts, both in Chicago and in Indiana. So, but I guess although I recognize the conflict in our history, it doesn't conflict with how I feel about this country and, I guess, and the way I conceive patriotism and nationalism. I'd love to hear what that root may be because that's where it's kind of vague for me, perhaps. And if we actually specifically define what that line is between patriotism and nationalism, because to me it still sounds a little bit similar, but maybe it's how
So
I'm hearing it.
So I'll hop in and just share what I feel the difference between patriotism and nationalism is. Jesse, we've had very similar experiences. Me moving from California to North Carolina to also attend seminary. And when I was in California, similar to you coming out of New York, I too, California is a very liberal state, very progressive. I went to one of the most liberal universities in the country, UC Berkeley. So of course, my views are shaped by that. And then moving to North Carolina, where people are very different than I am, was definitely eye-opening for me. So I already explained how my view of nationalism was shaped as a young person. As I started to understand patriotism was more recently in my life, probably just about 10 years ago. And some of you may recall when NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who played for the San Francisco 49ers, which I must say I'm a Raiders fan, but the 49ers was in our backyard. My dad is a staunch 49ers fan. He took a knee during the national anthem in, I think it was around 2015 or 2016, something like that. He was protesting police brutality, which I'm very familiar with, police brutality against my community and racial injustice in the United States. And so this gesture was kind of like a symbol of protest, a symbol of solidarity against systemic racism. But then he was labeled as being unpatriotic. And as a Black person, I couldn't understand how that was unpatriotic. And from my viewpoint, it was respectful. He didn't sit down during the national anthem. He took a knee. And so there was this huge full-on nationwide debate. And I know Luke said it's okay to be controversial on here. Colin Kaepernick was ultimately blackballed from the NFL and has not been able to play professional football ever since because of this, going all the way back to 2015, 2016. And so that's when I really started to dig into, well, what is patriotism? And so again, nationalism being one thing, but patriotism is more so characterized, I think, by just how much you love your country and the sense of pride you get from being an American or the achievements that we've made in America. And the reality is, I grew up loving this country, but America has not always returned that love to me and to my people for the very reason that Colin Kaepernick was protesting and taking a knee. So you have to realize that in 40 years of being on this earth, I have lived through things like the Rodney King beating in South Central LA. So there's, I'm shaped by that. I've lived through, the senseless, brutal killing of George Floyd, by a police officer. I have lived through very recently the killing of Sonia Massey, police brutality. The list goes on. But then again, I've lived through 9/11, when the whole country came together and everybody was, saying, God bless America. And everybody was, prayer was almost returned back to schools and people were praying for each other and we wanted to be together. So I've lived through all these different things, which has really shaped my view of, nationalism, but also patriotism. I go back to something that Dr. Martin Luther King said in one of his speeches. He said, America gave the Negro a bad check, which has come back marked insufficient funds. And this is because our relationship, our love for this country, we love, and I can really only speak for myself, but my family, but we love this country as much as anybody else, as much as someone standing next to me that is not African American. And we have helped to build this country. See, the thing is, when you think about love for this country, one thing that has to be discussed, and I don't think we talk about it enough. Everybody has a story. I appreciate you sharing yours, Jesse. Everybody has a story in which how they got to America. But the African American community is the only community who came here involuntarily, the only one. So, of course, there is an underlying complexity with our patriotism and some people's even sense of identity in nationalism, because we didn't come here voluntarily. We came here involuntarily. I am a product of that. And you have to discuss the legacy of slavery. And again, when you talk about what Dr. Martin Luther King quoted, the civil rights movement, just this long history in America, we are only 1 to 2 generations removed from that. My grandparents, who came from Wendell's part of the country, the Deep South, they migrated west during the Great Migration. They have a lot of stories that they have shared and what it meant to be Black, what it meant to be African American, being raised in the Deep South during that time. And so when you talk about your love for the country and being patriotic, again, there is a lot of complexities and a lot of complicated history that I think that kind of weighs into how much we love America. But I was talking to Luke the other day on the phone, and I told him, right now, the Olympics is going on, and you can't tell me nothing. During this time, I become real patriotic. The other day, I was watching the NBA or watching the men's basketball play against Serbia on Sunday, and LeBron and KD and one of my favorites, Steph Curry, go Warriors. You know what I mean? I get real deeply patriotic every 4 years during the time of the Olympics. So it comes and it goes, it shifts. I love the country. That doesn't change, but we have to acknowledge our position in this country and how much America loves the Black community.
No, that's good. I think it really shows. I mean, what you're talking about, what you and Jesse are talking about, and Wendell too, it's complex, right? It is more than it is often more than we know and more than we understand. And often, I mean, that's the challenge of labels, right? Is that once you slap a label on something, it means that that person is like whatever, is like X. And but the challenge is that people are much more complex than that. I mean, I was a racist for many years, because when I was 13, I was attacked on a bus in Seattle by 3 Black guys, kicked, beaten. And I was in Seattle, and there was a lot of Asians in Seattle. There's not a lot of African Americans, particularly in my part of Seattle. And it just, I, as a result of that experience, like, oh, this is how all Black people are. And it wasn't until my early 20s that I realized that I had this what I would call the sin of racism in me, and that I had to repent of that. And so I went to a Black friend of mine, and I said, listen, this is what happened to me. And I held this grudge. I held this hatred towards Black people because of that experience. And I was wrong. And so, that shapes my experience. That shapes my experience of the relationship between other people within America, the nation I love, right? Within, so I think we have these experiences what part of the country we come from is very different. Also, we're a giant country, a lot of people, which means we're going to have a lot of other cultural infusions that we're even unaware of, right? Like one of my favorite things to explore is what are the beliefs that people have that are just so ingrained because of where they come from that they don't even ask the question, is this true? Is like, it was this, I being a missionary all over the world, I saw this over and over where you go into a place and be like, I was riding a taxi in Croatia and I had my window down and the driver had his window down and I had come out, I had wet hair and he was like, you can't have your window down with wet hair. You'll die. And he was very passionate about it, like made me roll up my window, wouldn't go until I rolled up my window because he was like, you have wet hair. You cannot go down the road with your window open. Like it's a rule. It's an absolute rule. Like I'd never heard of that before. Like maybe, somebody will drop in the comment about where they come from. That's totally normal. But like it was like this is like a cultural thing that's so deeply ingrained that it's like everybody knows that you don't ride in a car with the window down when your hair's wet. That kind of thing happens all the time. And I to me, that's one of those, like, again, those things about nations that I find so fascinating and love so much. So I think there's so much of the of the label. It depends again upon experience and also perhaps to your point, first of all, Wendell, was like this idea of white Christian nationalism. And so I really want to get at where do we see the line between what I would say is like good nationalism / patriotism, because it seems like those two words are like largely synonymous. They're not totally synonymous, but they bump into each other pretty closely. And like bad nationalism, what we are, what if you say, if you're reacting to white Christian nationalism or white nationalism, what are you reacting to? What is the line that you're seeing there, and where do you put it and why? Also, Wendell, I'm going to put it on you.
No, so I've had a lot of time more recently to think about this, and again, the historian in me wants to dig into like when did all this start, right? This term, white Christian nationalism, and actually, I think it's Dr. Aubrey Hendricks who talks about white Christian nationalism, so tongue twister there, growing almost as a backlash to the civil rights movement. So you start seeing this rise in quote unquote white Christian nationalism around the late 1960s. Early 1970s, and as time grows in the political sense, more recently we see a stronger rise in white Christian nationalism. And it's interesting because I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with the Brookings Institution or Brookings Institute. I like to use them because they're pretty centrist in their ideology, in the sense of like they're used by conservatives and liberals in their research methodology. When Brookings did their last research effort on white Christian nationalists, what they discovered is that white Christian nationalists tend to hold a less favorable view of immigrants, as well as racial ethnic minorities. And they also seem to believe that racism, are less likely to believe that racism remains a problem in our country. And so these are self-identified. This isn't, they're going around based on where you live. These are people who self-identify as white Christian nationalists. I think that the concern for me is not in, I'm a proud Black person. I'm a proud American. I'm a proud Black American, right? I'm a proud Southerner. There is no concern in that. I think it goes back to what you said earlier, Luke, is when xenophobia starts to take place and when supremacist ideology starts to take place, right? When you believe that you're better than because you're a Christian, when you believe that you're better than because you're Black, right? When you believe that, or you're better than because you're white, or you believe that you're better than because you're American. Our way is the right way, right? And so I think that that's when the danger starts to come into nationalism. Krystal, you said something really, really profound earlier, and Luke, you also did as well. You talked about your exposure, the idea that you've gotten outside of the United States and have seen other places. Luke, you talked about your experience and what that rose up to into the period of your life where you were a racist. My mom was was one of the first to integrate her middle school, again, in southern Louisiana. My aunt was the last graduating class of an all black high school in southern Louisiana, right? That experience is what has informed their view of white people, right? My mom's graduated. She graduated from high school in 1975. When she graduated from high school in Terrebonne Parish in 1975, the local plant station was still operating.
Wow.
That shows you how far, that it's not that far removed from me. This is my mom I'm talking about, right? This is my
Well,
grandparents.
I was 2. I was alive. I was 2.
So
I'm that old, folks. I'm that old. Yes.
And I'm the younger of my siblings, and so even my view of how I view this nation is very different than the way that my brothers and my sister view this nation. And so for me, while I tell people all the time, the way that we view things is based on 2 things: our experience and our exposure, right? The more you experience and the more you're exposed to, the more tolerant you become of other people, and the better you view the world. And so for me, the difference between quote unquote good nationalism, or we have some political scientists who divide it into black nationalism, white nationalism, conservative nationalism. The difference between good nationalism and bad nationalism is when your ideology starts to step on the next man or the next woman, next human.
Yeah, I like that. Jesse, you want to take a stab at that? Where do you see the line?
Well, most certainly, I think that would most definitely be the line to me. Eh, anybody that's trying to get over another people. I don't necessarily think that perhaps that hatred comes from a national ideology necessarily, but perhaps from a personal prejudice, um, and even just negative ideas that float around certain communities about other communities. I mean, you even within, I think, all community, you're gonna feel a certain way. There's a I say a legendary conflict always between Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, right? And it's crazy because Puerto Ricans and Dominicans eat the same food, they dance the same music, they're literally living in the same tropical culture, both coming from like the same indigenous roots, but there's this conflict that happens between and oftentimes you'll hear Puerto Ricans say, no, Dominicans are such and such way, and Puerto Ricans are such and such way. So I think it's for certainly a reality. It exists, and we can all be guilty of that same sin. I guess for me is how do you do we all have the same perspective perhaps of what white nationalism or black nationalism is? Because I think it's not always very clear what that thing is, and it almost gives everybody license to call whatever they want to call that label. And for example, if we use a topic of immigration, according to Pew Research, 2/3 almost, I think, or 3/4 of the Latinos consider the crisis on the border, consider the situation on the border a crisis, that there should be a solution to that. Now, does that make them xenophobic? Does that make them anti-immigrants? I would say no, of course not, because we're all immigrants. We all see ourselves as immigrants. We all came here to this country as immigrants. So we're very clear with regards to who we are. But I think that if you look at the way some of the Dominicans or Puerto Ricans or even most Latinos who progress in the society, they all come through legal means. So for us, it's more like a legal question rather than, national ideological one, when it comes to the border crisis. But I feel that, you say a statement like what I said, other people are going to perceive it as xenophobic because there's not a very clear line of what actually this white nationalism, Black nationalism is. So, yeah, I think that's where I would say perhaps it's like what's, I get that, the stepping over somebody else, but what would you say to that? How would you react to that? How Latinos view immigration, for example? What would perhaps be some of the red flags for you with regards to that? And say, okay, this is the line of white nationalism, Hispanic nationalism, I guess, that would you have an answer to that, perhaps?
Me
Anybody?
or so
well, I,
Wendell or
yeah,
Wendell or Krystal, like, yeah. I mean, it to me, like, yeah, it's again, it's like the stickiness of labels is, can I think be problematic. And I would say that, I see, I also think that one of the, like, where I would have issues with what this label white Christian nationalism. Again, I'm white, I'm a Christian, and I'm a nationalist, but I'm not a white Christian nationalist. Like, you string them together in this, like, all the bad stuff of that, because
No, you are not, Luke.
thank you, I appreciate it. No, but it is
No, you're
it is
not.
it is the, I think it's the problem is, to me, is when the xenophobia, the anti-Semitism, the supremacist ideology, which means that it's like there's a difference between celebrating somebody else or celebrating my culture, my society, my group, like my people in Seattle. I love my people in Seattle, right? Like, and being like, I'm really proud that I'm from Seattle. And we pick on the people in Portland. Seattle and Portland are like rivals, right? Like, it's like those people down in Portland, they suck, right? Like, it's more joking, right? But if I was like, um, there is a, it's like that line between not only, in this kind of, there's a rivalry that can turn nasty. It can be, there's a rivalry that's fun, like between, every football season, right? There's the, like, their interstate rivalry, like, between two, the university and the state school or whatever. And then there's the rivalry that is like where that kind of, it goes too far and it becomes negative and it becomes like those people are cockroaches or bad. Like, it's you see this in the, in, I don't know, maybe I'm going off, but it's that, it is this, there's a good
you
there's a
sounded
fun
like
rivalry.
Tony Montana for a second. These cockroaches.
No, but there's a fine rivalry and a bad one, right? There's a good way of celebrating difference and a bad way of celebrating difference, or highlighting it, not celebrating, but highlighting difference as, like, all X people are bad, or all, like, to me, those are where the lines come in, and where I have, where I find that you have to be clear. That's not, I'm not against immigrants. I'm not, actually. I think we should have a lot more. I have an issue with illegal ones, right? Like, but do I think they're not human or less than human? Not at all. I just, like, would prefer, like, there to be a legal way to do this, because I also fear that they're easily exploited by people who, like, by people in, I mean, I don't order Grubhub in New York City because I'm not going to participate in what I consider the exploitation of migrants who are in New York City. I just don't do it. Because I think it's exploitive, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So,
I
don't
can
know.
agree with that.
I'm rambling a bit, but you know what I mean. But
No.
like Krystal or Wendell, please. I'm sorry.
No, Krystal, I'll let you go. You haven't said anything.
No, it's okay. This is a very good conversation. White Christian nationalism. I was starting to think about that because Luke, when you say I'm white, I'm a Christian, and I'm a nationalist, to know someone who identifies as that kind of, gives you a different kind of frame of reference for all of this. But it's not an ideal. It's like who you know, and for me, it's always more so been like this socio-political ideology. I mean, it fuses American nationalism, but then it fuses a particular interpretation of Christianity. But for me, it's always like this, it emphasized this white racial identity. And so, I have to look at, I don't know how you all, Luke, Jesse, and Wendell identify, but I identify as being Black before I'm a Christian. That's not something that was, that's also something that kind of like, because of my history and my people's history in this country and how I was brought up, I wasn't given a choice in that matter. I'm always reminded that I'm Black every single day that I wake up, unless I actually tell you that I'm a Christian, you don't know that I'm a Christian. And so, this whole ideology, it promotes, for me, like I said, we always talk about the United States. And this ideology promotes that the U.S. was founded upon Christian principles and this being a Christian nation. But again, we go back to the fact that this nation has not, acted in a very Christian in a Christian way throughout our nation's history. So we've seen a lot of it. This term has come up recently with Donald Trump. The term has come up since he was elected president and since he identified as a Republican, because I think before he was an independent, then he ran on a Republican ticket and won, or whatever the case may be. And a lot of people have, a lot of people in his base have identified, with this being white, being Christian, and being nationalism. But I want to say that one group of people in this country, in particular white people, do not have a monopoly on the American flag or on patriotism or on nationalism. Frederick Douglass, an AME preacher who was born into slavery many, many years ago, he actually denounced slaveholding and hypocritical Christianity. And all of these years later, one of the things that I love that he wrote this scathing critique. And he talked about how far hypocritical Christianity was from actually the religion of Jesus. So we've taken these religions and we've kind of made them and morphed them into what, we think they are, or think that they should be. But I think ultimately speaking, everybody on this podcast today is a Christian. And most of the people that are listening to us, the audience of the Philos Project is Christian. And I think one thing that we have to do is always keep the main thing, whereas we don't want to bring race into it. And we wish that, you could have a group of people that are Christians and you never even see people's colors because it's the thing that unites us. I don't know if you learned this Jesse, in seminary, but one of the things that I learned and always witnessed is that 11 o'clock a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour of the week. Why is that? We're Christians, but we all go into, our churches based on, our races, and we worship. And almost when you look at the history, it's almost like we serve two different gods. It really is like that. And we can talk more and more about that. But all of that to say, I wanted to go back to Frederick Douglass because I want to talk about the religion of Jesus. That is what we all have to continue to pattern ourselves after, and to continue. He models for us how we should treat our brothers and our sisters. I love, Luke, that you said that you don't feel like a person whose citizenship is not based in the United States is any less than you, because I'm the exact same way. And so ultimately speaking, that is, the love and the light of Christ that all of us have to show. if that makes sense.
So, Krystal, to your point, as we talk about nationalism and patriotism, I'm often reminded one of my favorite scriptures comes from the book of John, chapter 10, verse 16, where Jesus says, "I have other sheep I have of another fold." Basically, you're not even aware of, right? And I'm going to bring them in. They're going to be part of this fold as well. They're going to listen. We're going to listen to one voice. There'll be one shepherd. I'm often reminded of that scripture as I approach the work that we do. Philos Black, we often talk about focusing on three tenets: our spiritual identity as Christian, our ethnic identity at being in Africa, and our national identity being Black Americans. That is my identity. That's my personal identity. I don't believe that my personal identity is supreme. I don't think that it's better than any other group. I think that there are beautiful things about my culture and beautiful things about my background, but I believe that, it's manifested best when it's put up against everyone else and put next to, not up against, but next to everyone else. But even going back to something you said, this almost a Christian supremacist ideology that America was founded as a Christian nation when indeed it was not. I talk about this often. There were Christian principles that informed our nation's founding because many of our founders, most of our founders were Christian. But when you look at Thomas Jefferson, he was primarily a deist, right? There wasn't one sovereign God that came from him. You look at Madison, who was the founder or known as the father of our Constitution. He was a staunch advocate for religious freedom. He stated the religion of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man. You look at Benjamin Franklin. He didn't like organized religion. You look at Washington, an Episcopalian. Washington kept his religious life and his public life separate. So I struggle when I hear people say that America was founded as a Christian state when indeed we were not. And I think that ideology is what manifests itself in using biblical principles as law in this nation. I think that is what, oftentimes leads to this supremacist ideology. And when we get to that point of using our supremacy as Christians, that's when we start seeing, oppression of other groups. I mean, we even look at, the Christianity within itself being used throughout slavery to keep enslaved people enslaved.
Correct.
Right? Christianity being used as a weapon to condone slavery and to keep it in place in this nation. And so, to going back to your original question, Luke, I think that our biggest plight with whatever terminology you want to use, whether you want to call it supremacy, a white Christian nationalism, which I don't think that you should consider yourself a white Christian nationalist. I know you're white, I know you're Christian, and I know that you believe in nationalism, but I don't think that's a political term you want to use in this season because I know you, and I know you don't fit into the political bucket of that, Luke. But I think whatever label you want to label it, this idea of supremacy is the biggest threat to our nation, and it's the biggest threat to our global society.
Yeah. And you know what, Wendell, you hit the nail on the head, and Jesse said something earlier. Hatred doesn't come from a national identity, but it's rooted in that supremacy and in that superiority. I think one of the terms that I learned in school, American exceptionalism, but ultimately that we are superior, in our faith, because Christians have felt that way, as well as in your identity, and there is no room for that in the body of Christ.
Well, Jesse, you got a final point there because I got to wrap this thing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that Wendell said that I'm curious, but I guess where to begin? I would first, I think, ask you about what you said concerning this country not being founded by Christian principles, because I think that one of the statistics that I saw was that 80% of the founding documents in the 1800s quoted or alluded to the Hebrew Bible. So I feel like perhaps the individuals, because I understand that some of them weren't necessarily devoted Christians, but nonetheless, I think they were individuals that have been influenced by Christian ideas or Judeo-Christian ideas. So I think, I don't know if you disagree with that particular point, or you were referring more to the like white national figures.
And what I said, Jesse, was that although the country was influenced by Christian principles, we were not founded as a Christian state. I think that,
I
influence
see what
and
you
being
mean.
founded as something. The state of Israel is a Jewish state, right? Of course, it's been influenced by Jewish principles, but it's explicitly a Jewish state. You go to other Arab countries that are explicitly, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
we can be influenced by something and not be that thing. We're not a Christian state. There are Christian states across this world. America was not founded as a Christian state.
yeah,
In fact,
yeah.
it was the intention that we have religious freedoms. The Constitution starts off with it.
It's a constitutional right. Yeah.
All right. This has been an amazing conversation. We are over an hour, and I did try and keep it under an hour. It was my goal, but we're an hour and 6 minutes in, and I'm like, this
Just
conversation. I know we were just getting there. Everybody's like, wait, you gonna stop here? Because Wendell's and I'm gonna keep my mouth shut because I don't want to I want to have the last word, but I don't want.
We're gonna have to spend another hour.
I know.
Need a part two.
We're gonna have to do a part two. This has been so much fun, y'all. And I think my hope is that people who watch this will see that, like I started off, that we are diverse here at the Philos Project. And people actually will have a problem with that, which is annoying, actually. But you know what? I don't actually care that much because I think we are leaders, and I think we are thought leaders, and I do believe that we have to model the world we want. And which means that we model pluralism, we model diversity, and we model being able to be friends and have deep, profound conversations and also think differently at the same time. And the world needs more of this.
Amen.
Really, it really does. And in this season, the politics are going to be the politics, and we're gonna see them differently, and we're gonna weigh into these things. I mean, we have, we'll have a Democratic National Convention coming up, and there'll be stuff that's in the media. And the reality is, we are going to talk about those things. Does it mean that we're picking sides or we're saying this? No, what it means is that we are responding and engaging the current climate, the current conversation as Christians that care about not only each other, but our own nation, but also the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, how Christians engage in this world, what kind of, I think we are, I'm not a great, I don't think I'm a particularly good Christian. I think I'm a decent Christian, but I don't know if I'm all that good, but I try. Right. And I think that's the best that we can ask of our nations, is that they live up to the values and principles that are at their core. And if freedom and love for, we value rule of law, we value diversity, we value freedom at our core, that comes out. Do we always do it? No. Should we strive to be better in all things? Of course we should. And so we're going to have to just keep going. We're going to keep marching forward. We're going to keep keeping, the Bible says, don't let the sun go down in your anger. Me and Wendell and Krystal and Jesse will get into it on something at some point. I guarantee it. It's going to have a lot of fun. But it's okay. It's okay. So all that said, thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you, Wendell, Krystal, Jesse, for coming on this. And we're going to have to pick this up. I guarantee everybody's going to want more of this. Yes.
Let's do it.
All right. Thanks, everybody.